How's it going, everybody? It is 5:52 on Monday evening, and that means it's time for this week's edition of Riding in Cars with Cards. This is the show where I break down an archetype, a single 75 card list, a concept, a format, a selection of cards, anything that's specific to the actual cards being played and why they're being chosen the way they are. So, this week, I want to talk about an archetype that I think in Standard really gets completely and utterly overlooked. And that is Jeskai Control. Jeskai Control, really powerful, a lot better than people think it is, I would argue. So, all the focus in the Standard format right now is on Esper. And I mean, for pretty good reason, right? Thought Erasure is really good. Mortify is a nice little catch-all answer. You don't really get to utilize Hero of Precinct 1 in a proactive manner the same way you do in Esper. If you tried to bounce it over to Jeskai, like all the cards you want to play with Hero and Jeskai are more reactive. You can't, you don't have access to cards like Thought Erasure or Basilica Bellhaunt in Jeskai. The cards you have access to in those colors is like Justice Strike, Dovin's Veto, Ionize, and then stuff like Crackling Drake or Saheeli, or like Hero's not quite as good here unless you're building around it, where it's a lot better in Esper to just kind of have as intrinsic value. So already there's kind of a knock on Jeskai from the power level perspective, because you don't have that singular card that if your opponent doesn't answer is going to take over and ruin the game. But you know what you do have after sideboard? You have this little card called Legion Warboss that kills your opponent in 5 turns by itself, as long as you can protect it. But because of the nature of the deck being a little bit more reactive, cards like Absorb, cards like Dovin's Veto, Lightning Strike, Expansion Explosion, Teferi Hero of Dominaria, Teferi Time Reveler, there's a lot of different ways to build Jeskai Control. So what I wanted to stop and talk about today are kind of the different categories of cards that you can use within a Jeskai Control shell. Because there's a lot of different ways to build the deck. You can go all in on kind of the draw-go aspect of the deck, because you have access to a lot of different cards that do a lot of different things. And in a more draw-go-oriented version, where you're interested in playing lands and passing with the exception of tapping out for a finisher, you got a lot at your disposal. You've got Justice Strike, you've got Lightning Strike, you've got Shock, Shivan Fire, Flame Sweep as a board wipe. If we're talking about just, let's talk removal first, right? So Shock, Lightning Strike, Justice Strike, Flame Sweep, Deafening Clarion, Settle the Wreckage, Cleansing Nova, Time Wipe. All of these are cards you can play. These are definitely not all cards you should play in the same shell, but they are all cards you can play in some numbers. Now, what do you miss when you go from Esper to Jeskai? You miss the unconditional nature of a card like Cast Down. You miss the versatility of a card like Mortify. You don't have anything resembling a Mortify in Jeskai. But what you make up for, what you lose in versatility in that line, you make up in versatility by playing cards like Lightning Strike or Shock that can turn around and go upstairs and kill your opponent. Moving from removal into disruption, instead of having hand disruption in the form of, Thought Erasure in the main plus Duress on the board, you're much more interested in counter magic. And thanks to the addition of red, you pick up a couple of interesting options. You pick up Ionize as another way to kind of help your burn spells do their damage. Plays really well. It's a hard counter that's easier on your mana than Sinister Sabotage is. It's a hard counter that's easier on your mana than plain old Cancel, and gives just that little bit of a bonus. It's multicolored, so if you do decide to go down the Hero Precinct 1 road, you get a lot of things you can represent on 3 mana. Like It's reasonable. I'm not saying it's great, but it's a hard counter and it's just a reasonable magic card. I mean, and then just like Esper, you have access to Dovin's Veto, you have Absorb, you have Essence Scatter, you have Negate, you have, all the same counter spells that Esper does. Because there's not a blue-black counter spell. There's not a white-black counter spell. The other big loss is Basilica Bellhaunt as a disruptive feature. As much for, yes, I know Basilica Bellhaunt is also there as just a 3/4 for 4 that gains 3 life, but it's also a little bit disruptive. Chunks cards out of their hand, helps you gain life, strings the game out a little longer against aggro. We don't really have anything like that here. We don't have anything that does as good a job as Basilica Bellhaunt does at what it does. So instead, we just play more counter magic because we can. We have the room. We're not playing cards like necessarily cards like Hero or Bellhaunt. We don't have anything like that anyway. So instead, we're playing more counter magic. And I've seen a bunch of different lists that have played a bunch of different cards. I've helped tinker with several lists. Constructed criticism listener Jared, and I for the life of me cannot remember Jared's last name, but has shipped numerous Jeskai control lists to me. And the only reason I'm not reading one of those off right now is because I did not secure his permission to do so, and because I am recording on video while I'm driving, and I don't need to be reading while I'm driving. So, the style of play in question that you open up by playing Jeskai, because so much more of your removal is instant speed, because you are able to play so much more counter magic, you get to play more like a Drago control deck, where you answer in the early turns, and then you set up a scenario where you're trying to double spell through the middle of the game. You want to be able to counter spell plus do a little card draw, or counter spell plus removal, and then use another turn to do card draw to reload. Well, if you're interested in stringing the game out, how do you ever win? Well, I'm glad you may have asked. I'm glad I'm pretending that you asked me that. There's a lot of different ways to win the game with Drago. I mean, you're in Jeskai, most notably you're in blue-red, so you can play I'm going to play a really long game card and just try to string together a couple of copies of Expansion Explosion if your opponent gives you a chance. An explosion for 7 into an explosion for 11 down the line just probably kills your opponent if any of your other burn spells go upstairs, or if you're playing Ionize. I'm not saying it's the way you should play it, but it's definitely a way you can. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, can help make an explosion a little bit bigger. Expansion is useful with all of the other cards you play in your removal suite, your card draw, anything like that. So, actually killing your opponent can sometimes be a bit of a formality. It's one of the beautiful things about control and standard normally. Sometimes you can get by on playing essentially win condition free, but because you're playing Teferi, you can just deck your opponent. Because you can just Teferi and protect the Teferi until it ults because you're playing so much counter magic, and then get yourself into a position where you can ult your first Teferi and be working on exiling your opponent's permanents. All the while, every time you ult your Teferi, you can tuck the first one, you can tuck one back into the deck to make sure you don't deck out. Play a singleton copy of Nexus of Fate. I don't know. You do you. That's up to you how you actually win the game. But there's a few different lines to take. Again, the Drago route is going to be more interested in an instant speed answer, or something that's really powerful to protect, something like Teferi, something like Explosion, something like Nexus. More tap-out oriented versions that are going to be playing removal spells like Lava Coil, more interested in cards like Cleansing Nova, Deafening Clarion, or Time Wipe, are going to be interested in cards that dominate a clear board state. And there's 3 that really come to mind in Jeskai colors. The first is The first classification of card I would put in this is incremental advantage planeswalkers. Cards like Teferi Time Raveler, cards like Chandra, Acolyte of Flame if you're playing enough low-cost cards, or Narset Parter of Veils that just slow your opponents down, provide incremental advantages, put you in a position to play the long game. Or Teferi Hero of Dominaria also falls into this category. Incremental advantage, good to untap with, worth tapping out for, like really powerful. Sarkhan the Masterless is another card I've considered playing, and how effective Sarkhan is pretty well dependent on how many Planeswalkers you're playing, because it creates a weird scenario where you can play turn 3 Teferi Time Raveler, turn 4 like Narset, Saheeli, Chandra, whatever other 3-mana Planeswalker you're playing, and then on turn 5 you just go Sarkhan, attack you for 8, you're dead on board, do something about it. After playing kind of a medium control game the first couple of turns. And if it gets countered all well, you've got other ways to kill them. You've got a couple of Planeswalkers on the board, your opponent's resources are exhausted, you're in a position to be able to take over the game from there. But Sarkhan is also just like, the best way I can view Sarkhan is as a 5 mana for 2 4/4 flying creatures. Just one of them dies to shock. That's the best way I can describe using Sarkhan. Is you pay 5 mana, you put them, you minus and make a 4/4, and then they can either kill the 4/4 or kill the Sarkhan, but either way, you still have a 4/4 flying attacking them. That's worth tapping out for if you're a little bit ahead, or if you catch them unawares on a Settle the Wreckage. Even if you don't just curve out Planeswalker, Sarkhan, you can still do nonsense with, removal spell, counter magic, board wipe, Sarkhan, get to work. You're still dead in a couple of turns. Does not take long to close the game out from there. And then the last card, I can't not mention my guy, Niv-Mizzet Paran, who is still one of the most powerful creatures in Standard to untap with. I still, to this day, have never lost a game where I've untapped with a Niv-Mizzet in play. Hadn't happened yet. I'm not sure it's possible. I think there's a hidden line of text at the bottom of the card. You have to use a magnifying glass or something, get in there and really look at it. That says, if you untap with this card, win the game. Because, I just don't lose when I untap with Niv-Mizzet. I've lost games where I cast it and it died right away because, 6 mana is a lot and sometimes these things happen. But, the card's just really good. And especially, you get to untap with it and then you have all these counter magic, these counter spells, removal, and card draw. It's real easy for Niv-Mizzet to run away and hide with a game. And while we're on the subject of card draw, let's go into that category. Because for all the different ways you can win the game, I kind of broke down the main ones. I kind of broke down the ones people are interested in playing. I'm sure there are others. You can go all the way in on something like Drakaseth if you want. I don't recommend it, but you can do it. But when we're talking about card draw, that's where things get really interesting. Because your card draw is basically the same as every other control deck. You just get to... But by virtue of, Search for Escanta, the idea that you are more interested in Planeswalkers even than Esper control, making both Search for Escanta and Narset Parter of Veils more powerful. Narset falls into this category too, even though she's a disruptive element and a potential win condition if you're combining her with Sarkhan. She's also card selection. Card's dumb. It's so good. But we have Chemister's Insight. We have, Explosion is also card draw, even when it's, for 4 or 5, even if it's for 3 or 4. Still card draw, still drawing some cards. Drawn from Dreams is something I'm seeing a lot as a one-of. I think if you're interested in playing Drawn from Dreams, you've got to be at least a little interested in Kefnet God Eternal, which, while not strictly a card draw spell and is actually a really effective closer in a tap out strategy, Kefnit's at his best when you're utilizing cards like Drawn from Dreams, cards like Chemister's Insight, cards that cost 4 mana, essentially. And that's where a card like Rowl's Outburst, which is both removal plus card draw at the same time, can be really effective. So, maybe there's something there to work with. Maybe that's a deck I can sit down and start tinkering with a little bit. I don't know. I haven't gotten that far in like the brewing process for my list, but maybe there's something there to play with. But there's a little bit of overlap between the other control decks when it comes to card draw in Jeskai. There's not a lot that you get from red or white as far as card draw goes. Most of it's just blue, right? Like there's not an Azorius card draw spell that's really particularly powerful. Sphinx's Adenum, or Sphinx's whatever it is, I can't remember the name of it. The 4-drop with Adenum that draws an extra card if you cast it as a sorcery. Like that's okay, but you're already not playing that in Esper. We can continue not playing that in Jeskai as well. And then there's not an pure card draw spell. I will, like, an honorable mention goes to Crackling Drake as both a threat as a threat that replaces itself. So, like, it can fall in, it can kind of stride between categories, but on the whole, you're interested in a lot of the same cards to draw cards and get card selection that the other decks are. I will say one card I find to be kind of an underrated sleeper is Anticipate, and I know I catch a lot of flack for this. But it goes back to playing Grixis Control during Hour of Devastation Standard. And part of it, I think, was because the mana was so bad during that Standard. But I've just found a lot of success with helping make sure I hit my land drops, with being able to play thanks to the combination of the other card draw and then Anticipate helping smooth things out, I've been able to shave a land. But the ability to just make sure you draw the right cards early in the game is huge. And at instant speed for 2 mana, it does a good job of combining with some of the other cards you're interested in playing. If you're in for a card like Seal Away as a hard removal option, if you're in for Lightning Strike, if you're in for Dovin's Veto, if you're, all these other cards we talked about playing, you can represent any of those, but then have Anticipate to cast if your opponent doesn't do anything. And then obviously Opt, I feel like Opt is still an auto-include. Maybe I'm wrong. Probably am. But I can't see myself leaving home without him. I love that card. I'm going to miss it when it rotates, like a lot. So, that kind of wraps up the basic synopsis of Jeskai Control in Standard. It's a lot more complex than people think. There's a lot of different ways to build it outside of just counter and kill everything and play a Planeswalker. You can play, 15 Planeswalkers, be kind of light on counter spells, heavy on removal, or light on removal and heavy on counter spells. Let your Planeswalkers do a lot of the heavy lifting of interacting with permanents. There's a lot of different ways to go there. You can play almost entirely creature or permanent free outside of lands and, search for Escanta, which will eventually turn into a land, and like Niv Mizzet is your win condition. There's a ton of different ways to build Jeskai. So, I mean, if you've got the cards, or if you're close to having the cards, maybe give it a shot. Might be better than you think it is. I've pulled in the driveway. So, again, Jeskai Control, your pros, you have more removal that you want to play, if that makes sense. Shock and Disfigure are similar. Cast Down and Justice Strike are similar. Cast Down gets the nod as a more effective card, just by virtue of cards like Wild Growth Walker or Tomic, or, creatures with high toughness that you can't kill with Justice Strike. These things happen. And then, but you also pick up more counter magic because you already have absorb, you already have veto. You're okay with playing some number of like negate or scatter. But Ionize, I would argue, is strictly better than Sinister Sabotage in this kind of a shell because it's easier on your mana early in the game, which makes a world of difference when you're talking about trying to play, Cleansing Nova or something like that within the following turns. Deafening Clarion is a huge, huge boon. A little bit of an upgrade at times over Cry of the Carnarium as your fast action sweeper. It's worse against White Weenie, but it's better against Red because you can do something dumb like give a Crackling Drake or give your Niv Mizzet lifelink. That's kind of silly. Or, make the dragon token and then give it lifelink as you clear away all the small stuff. It's so good. So, and then for, threat-wise, I don't know that you get any better than Niv Mizzet. As just like the best thing to do in Standard at 6 mana. If you can protect it. Like, Command the Dreadhorde is a more powerful singular magic card, but Niv Mizzet is the best thing to untap with. I will die on that hill that Niv Mizzet is the best thing to untap with in Standard. So, and then access to, you lose access to Hero Precinct 1, not necessarily because you're out of its colors, but because you're playing less multicolored cards that are particularly worth playing. Like, you have to go way down a rabbit hole to make Hero good. But the payback you get is access to Legion Warboss out of the sideboard, which is a much bigger beating against decks like Nexus or Flood. Well, Nexus at least. You just jam it on the board and bash their face in. That's what you do. And especially if your opponent sees a heavy non-creature playing game 1 and they board into more copies of stuff like Veto and Negate to counter your Planeswalkers, maybe go way down the rabbit hole and play Elder Spell, and then you just jam a Warboss on turn 3 and start smashing them. It's a thing we can do. So, I mean, that's gonna wrap up this look at Jeskai Control. Again, I hope you take a look at it. Once I get permission from Jared to use his list, I will share it to give everybody a point of reference. But I will be talking a little bit more in depth about control decks as a whole on Thursday for Homeward Path. And until then, I will talk to you online. Take it easy.